Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Fossil Fuel Divestment webinar. My name is Domenica Reyes from GCCM, and I'll be presenting the panelists in the webinar. So the first part is we will begin with an opening prayer. So in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, Amen. Dear Lord, we pray for your creation. We pray for all your creatures on earth, as well as we are all affected by extreme weather events, rising tides, and the changing climate. We pray for people who risk their lives to defend creation and for all who have lost their lives in the mission of protecting Mother Earth. We pray that we will turn away from fossil fuels and choose new investment options such as renewable energy, and that we will be better share the gifts of creation. Amen. So to begin, I wanted to share this quote from Pope Francis, which says, "Civilization requires energy, but energy use must not destroy civilization." So to begin, we have our first panelist. She is Daniela Finamore. She's based in Rome, Italy. She is a coordinator of the International Catholic Divestment Campaign of the Global Catholic Climate Movement. Since 2017, she supports the GCCM in promoting advocacy initiatives to raise awareness around the importance to abandon fossil fuels companies. Before joining GCCM, Daniela supported the Policy and Advocacy Office of FOXIF, the Federation of Italian Christian Organizations. Welcome, Daniela.
Thank you, Domenica, and thanks everyone to join this webinar. Just a second, sorry, the first technical problems. Okay, I will start. I hope you all can see my screen. As anticipated by my colleague Domenica, I work as divestment coordinator for the Global Catholic Climate Movement, and it's since the early beginning of its foundation in 2015 that the GCCM focused its advocacy efforts on inviting the Catholic institution to divest from fossil fuels. And in my speech, I will try to tell more about divestment itself and some details about the Catholic campaign, the initiatives of the Catholic campaign, and next steps. Let's start with some basic on what is divestment. As you can read on slide, divestment is just the opposite of an investment. When you have money, you can decide to consume it, to save it for future consumption, or to invest it, that is to buy stocks, bonds, or other investment generating income. Divestment is just the opposite. You sell those stocks, bond, or other investment fund, and you can do it for several reasons. Because it is too risky, because you want to have immediate cash to use, or because you consider some sector on some companies, you consider them immoral. The concept of divestment rose to prominence as a key tactic in the downfall of the apartheid in the regime in South Africa. Apartheid denied basic rights to the majority of population of South Africa and was an immoral system. And companies that invested in or did business with apartheid South Africa were targeted for divestment. And the divestment tactic surely was successful in dismantling the apartheid. So the connection that you want to do is this tactic could be used and could be successful also to tackle the climate crisis. I will give just an overview of the different arguments that are behind the fossil fuel divestment. First of all, the burning of fossil fuels is the biggest contributor to climate change, and there are only a few companies responsible for their extraction. 200 companies hold the vast majority of listed coal, gas, and oil reserves. As scientists tell us, we are facing a dramatic climate emergency, and in order to have a chance of being in line with the Paris Agreement and keeping global temperature rise within a 2 degrees limit, around 80% of known fossil fuel reserves need to remain in the ground. This means that the 4/5 of the reserves of fossil fuels cannot be used, and this makes them worthless. And the numbers are even stronger and even higher if we are to achieve the most ambitious goal of 1.5 of the Paris Agreement, which is what scientists are urging us to do in the last IPCC report. The point is that currently the price of fossil fuels shares is calculated under the assumption that all fossil fuel reserves will be consumed. Assets in fossil fuels are currently overvalued because in the medium and long term, the world will have to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This over-evaluation can create what is called a carbon bubble, that is a financial bubble that can lead the world into an economic and financial crisis. As the perspective of campaigner, and also if we see divestment, as I was saying before, compare with what happened in South Africa with the apartheid, divestment is not primarily an economic or financial strategy, but is above all a social and political one. Divestment is a good strategy to create change-making investment decision. And this is why here I'm going to introduce and speak more about the moral argument for divestment from fossil fuel. So why Catholics should divest from fossil fuel? Because we consider them immoral. As Catholics, we are called to protect creation and all who share it. The climate crisis is an existential threat that humanity is facing and will face, and is affecting all creation, all people, and most of all the poor and the vulnerable ones. Fossil fuel divestment is a way to alleviate the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Is a way of currently put our money where our values are, and is a way to show that we are strongly committed to tackle the climate crisis. And this is a call that came also from high-level Catholic Church leader. Just to give you an example, for COP21, Catholic bishops from all continents said that we need to put an end to the fossil fuel era. Pope Francis, a lot of times, starting from the encyclical Lancet See, clearly recognized the importance to abandon fossil fuels. And recently, just in the occasion of a meeting with the executive of oil gas CEOs companies, he affirmed that the Paris Agreement clearly urged keeping most fossil fuels underground. Civilization requires energy, but the energy use must not destroy civilization. And just to complete this sort of overview regarding Catholic leaders' call to abandon fossil fuels, just to mention a recent initiative that happened in the Catholic Church, that is the Synod of the Amazon. In the Synod of the Amazon, as GCCM, we worked a lot to make clear the cry of the earth, of the cry of the poor, of the Amazon and of the Amazon people. And it was really important that in the final document of the Synod of the Amazon, the Synodal Fathers recognized this. They said, we assume and support the divestment campaigns from extractive companies related to the socio-ecological damage of the Amazon, starting with our own ecclesial institution and also in alliance with other churches. And making reference to this call coming from indigenous leaders from the Amazon, I would like to show you this short video from Patrizia Galinga, who in a press conference at the Vatican during the Synod made a very clear and strong call on divestment.
Tienen que desinvertir, no pueden seguir haciendo acciones que violenten derechos humanos, así sea indirectamente en otros lados. La Iglesia tiene que empezar a desinvertir, las diócesis, tal vez las universidades, no sé cuántas instituciones hay, pero tiene que haber una política de desinversión casa dentro de la Iglesia.
This work that we did for the Synod of the Amazon is just one part of the campaign that GCCM led in terms of fossil fuel divestment. As I said at the beginning, is since 2015 that divestment invite Catholic institutions to take this public commitment. And a particular point I would like to highlight, we invite Catholic institutions to make a divestment commitment and to make it public. This is really important because the divestment campaign, in order to be a campaign, needs to create impact, needs to have a social, economical impact. So it is important that Catholic institutions go public with their commitment and also inspire other institutions to do the same. At the moment, 163 Catholic institutions divested and joined the GCCM divestment campaign, and those Catholic institutions are in a total of more than 1,100 institutions that divested at global level. We also launched a few days ago a new toolkit that is available on our website. Then, as a follow-up of this webinar, we will send you all the useful information. In this toolkit, you will find all the material to learn more about divestment, to also go more in the details with the different arguments on divestment. And in this toolkit, you will also have practical suggestions on how to convince your institution to divest and on how to involve other Catholic faithful to join the campaign and be active in convincing their institution to divest. As I was saying, the GCCM promote public divestment announcement in the sense that we collect different divestment commitment and then we go public with this divestment commitment during the year in order to create an impact with this kind of advocacy initiatives. The next divestment announcement will be in occasion of an important event that will happen this March in Assisi, and this event is Economy of Francesco. The Pope called young economists, entrepreneurs and change makers to make a commitment to build a new economy. And we want to be there present, and we want to send a clear message. This new economy cannot contemplate fossil fuels. So I invite Catholic institutions, I invite you that are here attending this webinar to involve your institution to join this announcement. It is important to send a clear message that we need to change course. And I want to send a special appeal also to youth Catholic organization. Young Catholic are speaking clear about divestment. They want a green future, they want green job, and they want to abandon fossil fuel. So this event could be a good occasion to send a strong message from young people to the future. We need to divest now as a form of gratitude to God Creator, as a form of respect for the creation, and as a form of responsibility towards the future generation. It is no longer a question of if, but it's a question of when, and the answer is now. And I thanks a lot for your attention and for devoting your time to hear more about divestment, and I remain at your complete disposal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniela. So our next presentation is from James Buchanan. James is the Right Now campaign manager for the Christian climate change charity Operation NOAH. The Right Now campaign calls on churches in the UK to divest from fossil fuel companies and invest in clean alternatives. Several UK churches have taken steps toward divestment, including the Church of England and the Methodist Church. The United Reformed Church and Quakers in Britain have committed to full divestment from fossil fuels. In his role at Operation NOAH, James has worked closely with the global Catholic climate movement and others to encourage Catholic institutions in the UK to divest. Early this month, the first Catholic dioceses in England and Wales announced their decision to divest from fossil fuels. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Domenica, and thank you to everyone for joining this webinar today. I'm going to try sharing my screen with you as well, so hopefully you will see this. Okay, so hopefully you can see my presentation okay. So yes, as Domenica said, I work for Operation NOAH in the UK, which is a Christian climate change charity here. It's an ecumenical charity, so we work with all UK church denominations, encouraging them to divest from fossil fuels, and as well with the Catholic Church, with Catholic dioceses, with Catholic religious orders, and so on. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. I've been working on this issue for around 4 years now for Operation NOAH, and I think it's fair to say that in that time, divestment has become much more mainstream than when I started. I think it's now increasingly recognised as not just an ethical choice, a moral choice, and it's increasingly viewed also as the right thing to do financially, and just almost common sense, I would say, to consider divesting from fossil fuels. So just briefly about Operation NOAH's Right Now campaign. The campaign sort of has two main asks, the first of which is calling on churches in the UK and the Christian community to divest from companies involved in the extraction of fossil fuels. So there we're talking about, as Daniela said, the big oil companies. And secondly, to support the development of clean alternatives through investing in those alternatives to fossil fuels, investing in renewable energy and so on as well. So several UK churches, as Domenica mentioned in the introduction, have already divested from fossil fuels, including the Quakers in Britain, which were the first UK church to divest back in 2013, so really in the early days of the whole divestment movement. And the Church of Ireland in 2018, which is present in both Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland as well. One of the main churches that we've focused on is the Church of England. It's the largest church in the UK, also in terms of investments. And in this photo, you can see on the right-hand side the Bishop of Oxford, Bishop Stephen Croft. And here there was a group presenting a petition to Adam Matthews from the Church of England Pensions Board, calling on the Church of England to divest from fossil fuels. And in 2018, at the Church of England's General Synod, General Synod members voted to support divestment from oil companies that were not on track to align with the Paris Agreement targets by 2023. So we would have liked that to happen a bit faster, but it was definitely a step forward in the right direction. And the Methodist Church made a similar decision, and they're planning to divest from oil companies not aligned with the Paris targets this year. And as was also mentioned, in May last year, the United Reformed Church unanimously voted for fossil fuel divestment at its Mission Council meeting. And as you can see also from this photo, there were a few members of URC Youth, the United Reformed Church, the young people in the United Reformed Church, who actively involved that campaign and spoke up during that debate, calling for the United Reformed Church to divest. So this was a great example where I think young people had a really important role to play in that campaign. And as a result of this decision of the United Reformed Church, subsequently their investment managers, CCLA, decided to launch a fossil-free fund, so a specific fund which is no longer investing in fossil fuels, which is wonderful news. And that fund is available to different churches and charities in the UK. So I think that is an example of where the decision of be it a church or a diocese or whatever that makes this decision can have a much bigger impact, more widely in encouraging also other investors to also move their investments out of fossil fuels as well. Now, several churches in the UK and around the world have, including the Church of England, have been pursuing engagement with oil and gas companies. So continuing to invest in oil and gas companies and trying to influence change as shareholders. Now, we feel for a number of reasons this is unlikely to work. So I'd just like to say something briefly about that. There's various different groups. There's a very good organization called Carbon Tracker, which has done some work on one of the issues that Daniela mentioned earlier on, the risk of stranded assets. So in other words, the fact that the vast majority of oil and gas reserves need to stay in the ground if we're going to meet the Paris Agreement targets. And yet, in spite of that, many of the world's biggest oil and gas companies are investing huge sums in the exploration and extraction of new reserves for fossil fuels. So last year, the Financial Times published an article showing that the oil and gas industry is planning to spend $4.9 trillion, nearly $5 trillion on exploration and extraction of new reserves, none of which is compatible with the Paris Agreement, and that's over the next 10 years. And as well as that, many of the biggest oil companies are also lobbying against climate action. So another group called Influence Map did a very good report, which was again reported in The Guardian last year, showing that the 5 biggest publicly listed oil and gas companies have been spending $200 million per year to block, control and delay climate policy. So at the same time as saying that they support the Paris Agreement, on the other hand, they're also lobbying against climate action. I think in the last year, we've increasingly focused on, in our work, not only on some of the church denominations I mentioned before, but especially on Catholic church institutions. And last February, we organised a conference for religious orders which we did in partnership with the Global Catholic Climate Movement, with CAFOD, the National Justice and Peace Network, and some other groups here, which was at Mount Street Jesuit Centre in London. And 65 people came to that conference. And since then, well, during the conference, people heard from Sheila Kinsey, who's at the Centre for Religious in Rome, also from Lorna Gold, who's Vice Chair of the Global Catholic Climate Movement and also works for Troca in Ireland. So they were able to learn a bit more about the issue of divestment and why their religious orders should consider divesting from fossil fuels. I'm really glad to say that since that conference, a number of religious orders in the UK have decided to divest from fossil fuels. And this is a quote from one of the religious who came to that conference, Sister Frances Orchard, who's the provincial of a female religious order called the Congregation of Jesus. And she said, "We had previously supported engagement with oil and gas companies as we were impressed by the efforts of our investment managers to put pressure on those companies to change course. However, many of our younger members were rightly questioning our strategy, and our investment managers also became exasperated by the lack of integrity of the companies they were engaging with and agreed that the time had come to divest." So I think this is, again, something which I think increasingly groups that have perhaps supported engagement with oil and gas companies in the past are coming to the conclusion that they're not seeing results as they would want to, and that actually now is the time to divest. again, as Domenica mentioned, earlier this month, we had a divestment announcement, which was called the Epiphany Declaration for Fossil-Free Churches, which churches and Christian organizations from all different denominations joined. The Congregation of Jesus, which I just mentioned, is one of the religious orders that participated, as well as the English province of the Presentation Sisters. And as well as that, there were the first two Catholic dioceses to divest from fossil fuels, the Diocese of Middlesbrough and the Diocese of Lancaster. So that was really wonderful news. And we hope that many other dioceses here in England and Wales will follow their lead in the year ahead. Now, in many denominations in which we work, investments are held by also by local churches. So in those denominations, we would invite people to get their local churches to divest from fossil fuels. In the case of the Catholic Church, this might vary according to different countries, but I think it's true that most investments in the Catholic Church are held by dioceses, also obviously by religious orders as well. So in that case, we would encourage people to contact people in their diocese. So for instance, to contact their bishop, to get in touch with the head of finance and the trustees in that diocese, to encourage them to divest from fossil fuels, to encourage the diocese to divest. We found often the Diocesan Justice and Peace Commission is quite influential in different dioceses in helping to bring about that change. And so I think that's a group that would be, in many places, would be a really key group to work with in order to encourage your diocese to divest from fossil fuels. Just to mention a resource which we published about 18 months ago, which will be a useful resource report for you to have a look at if you're interested in learning a bit more in detail about some of the issues. We published a report called Fossil-Free Churches, which you can find on our website, on the Bright Now website. So if you type in Fossil-Free Churches and Bright Now on Google, you should hopefully find that report if you're interested in learning a bit more. I'd just like to end with a quote from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, which he said a few months ago. He said, "Divestment will send a positive and hopeful message to the people of this country and to those in vulnerable communities across the globe who will be most immediately affected by climate-related disasters." So thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So, okay, to continue with today's presentation, we have now Kyle Rosenthal. Kyle is a student at Boston College studying operations, information systems, and social impact. He has been an environmental activist since he was very young and has spent the last 3 years working on divestment campaigns as a leader of the Catholic Divestment Network. Through this work, he's part of the Laudato Si generation, a youth initiative of GCCM. He also manages various programs for the marine conservation organization Element Hope. Welcome, Kale.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here, and also really want to thank James and Daniela for what they said. We've heard here already youth mentioned quite a few times, so I'm really excited to speak on that topic. I'm also just going to share a few slides here. So again, I'm a student at Boston College, and I'm a co-coordinator of the Catholic Divestment Network, which is a coalition of a lot of Catholic universities, mainly in the US and especially Jesuit ones. There are 27 Jesuit universities in the US, so we have a lot of different groups to coordinate with across all those different campuses across the country. So just to start, I just want to go over a little of the sort of history and direction of the youth divestment movement, particularly in a university context. You know, as with any historical movement or issue, we can see, you know, learning from the past and not making the same mistakes is really important. And I think that that's something that, especially here at Boston College, we've taken as, you know, we've had a divestment movement for over a decade now. So we've seen, you know, what has worked and what hasn't. And again, you know, we have a lot of people who are much older than us who are giving us some great advice and tips, and we're using that, you know, as we move towards this new space. as Daniela also mentioned, divestment from South Africa is a very important, relevant, and related topic to what we're working on. Again, particularly at my university, but at many others around the U.S., they did divest from apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s. And so we're using that as we kind of make our case for divestment from fossil fuels today. What we're seeing, though, is this interesting shift of the moral versus the financial arguments around these different movements. And that's something I'll get into a little bit later. But again, we're here talking from a Catholic and Christian context, which is very important, especially when, a university or an institution follows that. But then there's also these financial arguments that are kind of tangling things up. But at the same time, we're also kind of leveraging those together to make this larger case and movement. And this last point here just is a general discussion of sort of the different tactics of the divestment movement and the climate justice movements. Like I said, we're taking a lot of the different tactics that we've seen in the past, such as die-ins and strikes and things like that, and using those. But again, we're also seeing this shift of attention where, a local action can really get this national and international attention. If you're familiar with the Harvard-Yale football game that happened a few months ago, I definitely recommend looking that up if you haven't. But again, we're seeing things that would be very important, movements and tactics that we're seeing, but these are getting, again, national and international attention. And I think that's where young people really have this important role to play because, that's the world that we've grown up in. We're very apt with media, social media, and just getting the word out about these things. So, sometimes we'll do a press release on an event, but we'll also create, a hashtag or something around that. And again, I think that is a really important part of this youth movement because there's people from everywhere hearing about it. And that's where we see these coalitions forming that we haven't seen before, where we have, 30, 40, 50 universities or groups of students all coming together for one big movement. And so along those lines, again, collaborating with other movements is really important, especially in this youth context. I think it's been mentioned a few times today, but it's really important to recognize this intersectionality of climate justice. And that can mean a lot of different things. But basically, we want to fight climate change, but the reason we're fighting climate change is not just because it'll affect one or a few people, it will affect all of us, but also it'll affect these very specific frontline communities first. We see it in the US and many other places around the world, coal and other air pollution is affecting mainly minority communities. And then we're also seeing indigenous people specifically affected by, again, a lot of these issues. And so we can't really have this isolated movement. And I think young people, again, are seeing that. And that's where we see this trajectory over time of different actions and movements. And I've listed a few here, but, everything from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter to these indigenous movements to, to stop pipelines and things like that. They're all kind of coalescing because, again, we can't focus on just climate change because that is an issue, but it's, part of all of these larger contexts that we have to take into account. And so, again, really, really important to recognize that there are these other communities that are important in these movements. And, universities are sort of the epicenter of almost every movement that we've seen over the last few decades. And so, again, we need to incorporate all of these different pieces of things that we're seeing as movements because, united, we have this stronger front. And again, just back to this intersectionality point, I think one of the funniest comments I've ever heard in response to us asking for divestment from our university here at Boston College was, well, if we divest from fossil fuels, what are you going to ask for next? Do you want us to divest from private prisons? And I think it's such a funny question that they responded with because our answer is, absolutely yes. One of the leading causes of death in private prisons following suicide is heat-related illnesses, which, as we know, will only become, more intense and more severe due to climate change, again, as that heat, the global temperatures rise. So again, there are a lot of different pieces to this that we need to incorporate. And I think as young people, as a youth movement, we're recognizing that because we all, we may want different things, but again, they're all sort of related in this larger context that's really, really important. And so looking at this recognition of the power of youth, and again, I think everyone can recognize this power, but I think there's, again, just this particular upswell, in the last few years, especially of youth. And this first point that I have of fearlessness of youth is really interesting because there definitely is this, youthful fearlessness that's really important. At the same time, recognizing that there is a lot of fear as well that's important to balance. even me speaking today is going to, further cause, some enemies at my university, and just really anywhere. There are people who are, very entrenched, fossil fuel companies, very wealthy people who are very scared of what we're saying. And I think that's good though, because that, that means we're doing something right. But so again, it's this interesting balance where, we're not totally afraid and we're balancing that. But again, there's this fearless aspect of youth where, we do have a whole career ahead of us and reputation that we may be putting on the line, but we also, know that we're in this interesting space, again, particularly in university life, but also whether it's high school, middle school, any age, where we can really take action now because we need to, but also because, again, we're in this particular place in our lives as young people. And again, that relates to this idea that we all have an institution to confront. A lot of the comments that I've heard from adults that I've worked with is, what can I actually do? I want to do something, but, who do I have to fight? Who do I have to ask to divest? And I think it's really important to recognize that we all have somewhere, someone that we can confront, in some type of way, whether that's a church, a diocese, a government agency, a university, whether we're a student, an alumni, anything like that. There's always something that we can do. And again, this idea of being a global citizen, but also a citizen of really anywhere. And I think we're seeing this whole globalization, movement or trend historically, where we all are related and have some type of, we are all affected, I guess I should say, by other people's decisions. As we've heard a lot of different bishops and other important leaders mentioned today, but the decisions of a bishop to divest over in Italy will have an effect on my decisions in my life in the long term over here in the US. And I think that's really important to recognize because again, we don't really have to be afraid to call up or confront or send a letter to the Pope or a bishop in another country or state, or again, even just a politician or leader in another state or area. They all essentially represent us in some way because their decisions, do affect us in this larger issue. And I think that's really important to recognize. And I think young people, again, are recognizing that by forming these coalitions and by connecting with people, from everywhere around the world, it's international, it's intergenerational, cross-border, cross-culture, because again, this issue affects us all, but also, us having this big upswelling of support and action, will influence all of those people as well. And so looking at faith as a particular solution, again, I think it's very interesting that there's this big perception of millennials, Gen Z, just in general, younger people leaving a religion. And that is true to some extent. There's this whole debate of being religious versus spiritual and people, interpreting faith as they will. But I think it's part of also this larger discussion of, young people leaving traditional values, however you may want to define that. And I think that's part of this globalization. But I think if anything, that's almost a benefit. We see people, I think, actually engaging more with the church, especially young people who want action. Again, that's sort of been my focus of the last few years, is engaging with religious institutions that I'm a part of and also ones that I'm not a part of. But because we see that there are still over 1 billion Catholics in the world, and, even more Christians, and they are recognizing that even though some people may be leaving, there is a movement, and it's possible to get those people back in the church or to prevent further people from leaving by recognizing that, these issues of creation and climate justice. And again, these other movements that I mentioned are part of this larger issue and this larger, I guess, move from traditional values. But again, we can kind of incorporate them within that traditional framework. And that's where I see, climate justice as this pro-life issue. And, that's a very contentious point politically, around the world, but also specifically within the church. And I think it's really, really important to recognize that creation and climate justice are a pro-life issue. And, various priests, bishops have mentioned that, and the Pope has addressed that in a few ways. But again, it's really important to really call that out and bring that to the forefront of attention, and not to discount other pro-life issues, but to recognize that, millions of climate refugees, already exist, and even millions more will come. We see, people being hundreds of thousands, people are being displaced in Indonesia a few weeks ago, and again, in Australia, we're seeing, a billion species die. And again, thousands and millions being displaced and killed. And again, we need to recognize that, again, there are other pro-life and other religious issues that are important, but this is an immediate one. And I think, again, what's important to recognize is that there are immediate steps that we can take that, can prevent or hopefully stop all of this. Divestment is part of, again, this larger issue of climate justice that will hopefully influence our institutions and our governments, and, hopefully end these fossil fuel companies. And what I think that's really important is we do see a path forward. Maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the argument could be made, what would divestment do? It's important, but it might just be symbolic. Now, we're seeing trillions of dollars divested. And I think, again, what's really, really important about that fact is that we are seeing it have an effect today. And because that's a tangible, immediate step that we can take as part of this pro-life issue, as part of this larger creation issue, as part of this larger justice and peace issue, again, hopefully preventing drought, wars that, may be impacted by drought, displacement, flooding, all of those things come to this issue, and we have those solutions for it. So again, I think youth are recognizing that because, they haven't been affected by, 50, 60, 70 years of saying, well, that, is an issue that can be addressed later, because we're feeling the effects now. Young people who are just existing, as this is already an issue, have this clear and new perspective that I think is really important about why it is that this should be a priority, because we can address it. So again, we all have different groups, organizations, people that we can bring this up to, confront. And again, I think it's really important to see how we frame it depending on the context that we're in, but using those lessons of the past and using this power of youth and of this intergenerational movement to say, hey, this is, our new perspective on it. This is why it's affecting us. And these are the things that you can actually do to solve it. And again, I think those are all really, really important. So thank you. That's all I have on the youth movement. But again, there's a lot more out there that I think is really important, and that you should definitely check out different coalitions. And, if you live near a university or are engaged with one, reach out to the students there, because I think it's really important to engage with them on a lot of these different issues.
Great, thank you, Kyle. So as we said at the beginning, right now we are going to have a couple of minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please write in the chat box and our panelists will be responding. So I'm going to read the question, and if you want to do a specific question either to Daniela, James, or Kyle, please write down in the chat box. So, okay, so we have a couple of questions. One from Patrick Dowling. He says, how many Catholic institutions have divested so far? Maybe Daniela, could you help with that response?
Yes, at the moment we have 163 Catholic institutions that have divested publicly with the GCCM. I just make this observation because we discover working with Catholic institutions, for example, that some of them are already divested, some of them divested but do not want to make the decision public. My list of 163 is the institution that divested and joined the announcement, the public announcement of the GCCM.
Thank you, Daniela. Here's another question. It says, which way as a church do we continue to raise awareness so that the industries reduce the use of fossil fuels? It's open to anyone. Maybe Kyle or James, would you like to respond?
I could say something about that. I think, yeah, that is a really important thing as well. And here in the UK, most Catholic dioceses in England and Wales have now switched to getting their electricity from a renewable energy supplier. So I think is the case now that 20 out of 22 Catholic dioceses in England and Wales are now getting their energy from renewable energy. So, so I guess wherever this is a possibility, which I guess in many different countries it would be possible now to get generate electricity, buy your electricity from renewable sources, then I would strongly recommend that. I think also from an economic point of view, it's now the case that in many countries in the world, renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels when it comes to electricity. So, so it's not just it doesn't just make sort of sense from an ethical point of view, but also from a sort of financial point of view.
Thank you, James. Here's a question for Kyle, and it says, Kyle, what recommendations do you have for engaging with youth leaders in a good way?
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question to ask, because I've seen it done in positive and negative ways before. I think what's important is to say it is good to engage with young people. I think sometimes there's a perception that young people may want to exclude other people from the movement, and that's not true. And I think how you frame the question is important. You know, there is a positive way to engage with young people. It really does depend on the context that you're in, geographically and also institutionally. So I would just reach out as best you can and just say, hey, you know, this is why I'm either as an individual or as an organization, and here are some ways I may be able to help, but we'd love to hear what it is that you want to accomplish, you know, and how can we support you in that. That may just be having, you know, you attend a strike, but it may be something larger like, hey, can you help promote us, you know, on social media, or can you actually reach out to this institution because, you know, maybe you have some power in there. So again, it really depends on that context, and I just would encourage you to reach out to any group that you may be encountering in that regard.
Thank you, Kyle. So we have another question. This is open for anyone who has the information, and it's, how has this divestment movement been received or taken up in the Global South?
Probably we can give different perspective on that. In terms of commitment with the Catholic divestment campaign, it is 1.5 years, I would say that we received also very relevant commitment also from the Global South. But in terms of number of institutions, they are a small percentage, but there is a lot of awareness about the importance of this movement. And for example, we received also different kind of symbolic commitment from institutions in the Global South. Symbolic commitment is like, okay, we do not have money to divest, but we want to endorse your campaign because it has an impact on our daily life. It is also important to understand that each country has its own complexity. So in some country in which the fossil fuel companies have a lot of importance in the national economy, the divestment campaign has more complexity to reach different kind of institution. But I would say that generally, according to the conversation that we had with the Global South partner and with target institution, there was a good approach towards the campaign.
Probably just to add to what Daniela has said, one of the partners that we've worked with quite a lot, and I know that Daniela and GCCM have worked with as well, is Rachel Mash, who works for the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. And the Anglican Church of Southern Africa divested from fossil fuels back in 2016. And have been really influential, I would say, both in the sort of broader divestment movement and also in South Africa in terms of urging financial institutions to offer fossil-free funds. So the divestment announcement that Daniela mentioned is in March. The global one is one which we're working on together. So GCCM also ourselves at Operation Noah, but also with Green Anglicans. So that's Rachel working in the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, but all across the world, the Anglican Communion, and World Council of Churches as well, and Green Faith. So we really hope that in that announcement there will be institutions from all over the world that participate in that announcement.
Thank you, James. So because of time, we're going to take a couple of questions more. And one of them is why the other churches don't understand the great urgency to divest. Anyone who would like to respond?
I can try to speak to that a little bit. Again, like I mentioned, I'm at Boston College. My university has a $2.6 billion endowment, and we actually haven't divested, which is very frustrating as, a youth leader of this movement. I work on a lot of different campaigns at other universities and other churches. One of the biggest reasons that we've heard, I think, is just that, I think in general, a lot of people, churches at least, agree morally that this is important. And, there are some that may not, but for financial reasons, they see this as, a benefit in the short term, which is concerning to us because, as Daniela and James mentioned, we see these as stranded assets, as this carbon bubble, and we actually know that financially it doesn't make sense to stay invested in these things. But because, some of these people have been working in this space for 30, 40, 50 years, they haven't seen, the results from the alternative side, which, renewables are better off. And so it's just this general concern that I think there will be financial losses from divesting, which again, I think there are a lot of resources that the GCCM has that show that that's actually not the case. But I think that's just a lot of the reason that's been given because, again, there's been this perception for so long that those alternatives are not viable, again, even though we know that they are.
Thanks, Kyle. And the last question is, where an economy is strongly fossil fuel dependent, like Australia, does divestment show a path to a just transition? Again, this question is open to anyone.
I guess I can say something about that. One of the places where we're working quite a lot to try and encourage divestment is in Scotland. And as I'm sure many of you will be aware, Scotland, the UK, is going to be hosting the COP at the end of this year in Glasgow, the UN climate talks. And Scotland is a place where, because of there's been a strong presence of the oil and gas industry in the northeast of Scotland. So for that reason, I think with some of the churches in Scotland, when it's come to the topic of divestment, there's been quite a sort of live debate about whether it's better to divest from those companies or whether it's better to continue engagement as shareholders. But there are, a couple of churches, the Episcopal Church, Scottish Episcopal Church last year voted to support a motion that basically said there's a moral imperative to divest from fossil fuels. And I think at the same time as divestment, it's important as well, the just transition. Because obviously there are people who work in the oil and gas industry, who have done for many years and who depend on that industry for their livelihoods. But really, if the transition can start from fossil fuels to renewables, if that transition starts today, it's really much better for everyone. It's better for the climate, better for humanity, and it's also better for people working in those industries if they're skilled up to be able to do green jobs, if the governments can help with the creation of those jobs. So really, everyone benefits if that transition starts now.
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for your time during this webinar. So here again, it's an open invitation to join the next announcement or next futures announcement that will come this year and the next year. And also at GCCM website in this Catholic Climate Movement Global Divest and Reinvest, we have a new toolkit which has a lot of information, resources that you can use. And also, since this is a growing movement, there is a lot of information that you can find. You can go also to the Right Now campaign website to find more resources that will be useful for you and start this conversation about divestment. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, James, Kyle, and Daniela, and see you in the next time. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.